Imagine an event or a person in history that you had to describe in 2 words to somebody who had never heard of that person or that event. If you had to describe what or who you thought it was, how would you do it? What would be important to you so that you could fully relate what you wanted to fully to that person? I'll give you a name, for example, and you tell me how you describe this person's life in 2 words. Ready? Donald Trump. Now, just sit there. Sit in where you are, wherever that is, and whatever description is in your mind, because I can guarantee you had some kind of reaction. Now, imagine what will be described of him in 20 years, 30, 50. How we perceive history or the people in it is what we'll be talking about today on this episode of This Famous Vendetta. I'm your host, Jason Hatfield. Welcome. We're so glad to have you back for this second, arguably first, full content episode. And there's a lot to analyze, so let's get to it. There are absolutely strong feelings about our current president, and that's for sure. That is undeniable. How will those feelings be for people in the future? What are the verifiable acts he's done that will define him for those people, and will they change? Now, let's pivot away from that obvious minefield and turn it to a couple of other people and events in history as we introduce our next, arguably, the most famous of my ancestors. Now, for those of you just joining us for the first time, welcome. This show is about challenging historical perspectives in search for a more honest narrative, with an anchor in my own family history, the feud between the Hatfields and the McCoys. In the last episode, we did sort of a snapshot of my ancestor, my great-great-grandfather Valentine Uncle Wall Hatfield, a more peripheral character in the story, though we'll learn more about him in upcoming episodes. Today, we'll be talking about his younger brother, Anderson. Now, just around the pandemic, I went with my wife and uncle, the Episcopalian priest uncle you may also remember my talking about last episode, to view the places he, my father, and their family lived. You see, I had done this once before with dad and mom, and this time I wanted to get GPS coordinates just so I could have it for the future. One stop with my parents was at a somewhat random house, at least to me, yellow, nothing grandiose. And my dad just got out of the car and tells me to come along. And I'm thinking, huh? Whose house is this? And he just casually walks into the yard up to a stone bench. Nothing necessarily remarkable about it. It wasn't as polished as a bench you'd find at a, garden outlet. And Dad stops and he just looks at this thing. And after a brief pause, he looks at me, points to the bench and says, "That's Valentine's hearth." What? Valentine's hearth? Valentine's hearth? Where his food was cooked, around which his family sat and kept warm, told stories, shared the news of the day. This was it. And here it had been propped up on 4 cinder blocks with its back to a tree, now repurposed to sit on and, enjoy a morning or afternoon. It was probably about 4 or 5 feet across, thick towards the back, thinning out with a gentle curve towards the front. It had moss growing on it and fallen sticks laying across it. An otherwise nondescript bench had been the literal hearth of my ancestor. Kind of makes you stop and wonder when you look around what other ordinary things, ordinary places hold unimaginable memory and history. It's kind of oppressive when you let it sink in. And that was the first piece of family history I got to see, and more amazingly, touch. We would wind up walking up to this house, me having no idea what was going on. Where it would be revealed was the house of an uncle of my father's, who invited us in, and I saw the first actual picture of Valentine, only one of two depictions of him I'm even aware of existing, and that was awesome. Another one of our stops was at the statue of Anderson Hatfield at the Hatfield Cemetery in Sarah Ann, West Virginia. It's a small town with a population of just over 200. Now, my father's direct family never lived in Sarah Ann. They lived down the road in a small community known as Devon. Still, with Anderson's notoriety and role in this conflict, it was important we stopped by the cemetery, which is listed on the Register of Historic Places, and I saw this famous statue for the first time. Now, if you haven't been there to see this, it's fascinating. Situated on the side of a mountain with a steep, rocky path leading up to it, and Italian sculpted marble, supposedly life-sized statue of Anderson Hatfield stands on a 7-foot pedestal overlooking the final resting place of he and his wife Levice. Allegedly, its back is forever turned on the west, where the clan his family is forever tied to resides. The gate enclosing this particular grave was shut, and it was your typical grave with an Italian sculpture standing guard. Now, fast forward over 20 years, I'm there with my wife and my uncle. That gate door was gone, and you could easily access the grave. And there were flags and coins, rocks, a veritable shrine to him, completely opposite to my last visit. Why? What do the people coming to visit see in him? What made them think he was who he was? I mean, a book? A television show? I mean, who do they think he was? A hero? An outlaw? Is it the idea of who they want him to be? I mean, honestly, I'm surprised that he and the conflict he was in has continued to be of such interest to so many people. I mean, what is it about this that has made it recapture the imagination of people in this country for the 136 years since its, technical end? Are there people that you revere that are the same? I mean, be careful about meeting your heroes. If you don't know that saying, please learn it. Regardless of who that person is, they rarely are the people you hope they are. Now, I'm not trying to be a downer. You can meet a lot of nice people, and a lot of people are nice. But let's be honest, we tend to project who we want them to be onto them. We'll read their words, hear their deeds, and almost deify many of them. I'm not saying you're never right, but I've met some heroes, and there was one particular one that led me to never wish to do so again. And if you're interested, we can chat, but we're not going to get into that now. We should chat about the subject of that statue, Anderson Hatfield, and the next person of interest in this story. He was a great uncle of mine, younger brother of my ancestor, Valentine. And if you recall from our last episode, I talked about how a relative of mine's family was burned out of his home during the Civil War, only that they weren't. They were turned out due to the cunning use of not proofreading your source. That situation apparently happened to him. Now, the name Anderson is typically in this Aryan time shortened to Ants. Not sure if that's a common thing or not, but he also had a cousin named Anderson that was also shortened to Ants. But somewhere along the way, this Ants was given the title Devil Ants, and that is how he's best known. Now, for the record, his cousin, a minister, was also known as Preacher Ants. Preacher Ants, Devil Ants. Okay. How he earned such a name is also not clear. Now, one book claimed that his mother said that he was not afraid of the devil himself after having killed a panther. And another, that Randall McCoy, who we'll learn as the patriarch of the McCoy clan, was said to have claimed Ants was 6 feet of devil and 180 pounds of hell. Or another was his alleged defense of an outcropping known as the Devil's Backbone during the Civil War. Regardless of how he got the name, and we can look further into that, he's known as Devil Ants. He's typically considered to be the patriarch of the Hatfields in this story, as we'll learn about Randall is with the McCoys. Now, Anderson's name, And devil ants may very well be the cause for the fascination with him. This name may be it entirely, devil ants. I mean, pretty unique name, right? I mean, what if I decided to change my name to Devil J, Jason Asmodeus? Probably wouldn't sit well with the parents at my school. And by the way, devil ants used to trap bears and keep them as pets. Yep, that happened. Not necessarily pertinent to this story, but also a neat piece of cocktail trivia. You're welcome. I just so happen to live in one of only 4 states that could allow me to keep a bear as a pet, but my county has a law against it. So thanks a lot, big government. Okay, so devil ants had bears for pets. Okay, I get why people think he's cool. Either that or, he was the Appalachian Siegfried and Roy without the shiny costumes and magic. Another story to help define ants was that he told an author of one book where he went hunting with his dogs and shot at a buck. He missed, and in his pursuit, wasn't aware that he had upended and emptied his shot bag. This was, at least for him, before bullet cartridges that we're used to today. He was using black powder and ball. So he's chasing after this buck with a gun, black powder horn, no bullets, and his dogs are chasing this buck out of the country. Well, he comes across a 4-year-old bear asleep in a hole filled with leaves, and he gets mad. I mean, by this point, he realizes he doesn't have anything with which to shoot. Another prize he can't get because he has no ammunition. So he does what any common sense hunter would do. He jumps in and begins to kick the stuffing out of the bear before the bear could even get his eyes open. Kick the stuffing, literal quotes here. The bear is so startled, he runs out of the hole and runs up a tree. Now, Ants hollers and keeps the bear in that tree for at least a day and a night, and eventually Valentine arrives, who is called Wally in this scenario. Wait a minute. Wally. This book referenced Valentine in this story as Wally. Wally? Wall? Is that how he gets his name for Wall? Well, kick my stuffins. Is it short for Wally, or is Wally a play on Wall? I mean, Valentine to Val to Wall to Wally, or Wally to Wall. Well, that's where we get Wall. I think they called him Wally for short instead of Valentine, and that just made it Wall. I'll have to marinate on that one for a bit. Well, anyway, Wally, according to this book's account, and a friend come through, as well as the return of Ants's dogs, as Wally was sent by his parents to find Ants, as he had been gone for, so long. Checking to see if Ants is okay, Ants tells Wall to go get him some bullets because he refuses to leave until he bags this bear that he's run up a tree, which he'll do. He's 15 at this time. Now, is this story true? Well, his grandson felt it was, as he had allegedly told him the story. I remember one of my grandfathers trying to tell me that the round bales of hay you'd see on farmland as you traveled through Tennessee was illegal in other states because cows couldn't get a square meal. I've used that story so much. I used it when we went to the UK on our Irish tour guide. It got the exact same reaction as you'd get anywhere here. Dad jokes are universal. So I don't know if the story's 100%. It very well could have been. Devil Ants has, however, lived quite the life regardless, and there's a lot to marvel over. So he's born in 1839. He's the 5th child of Big Eve and Nancy after John, Valentine, Elizabeth, and Martha. He's tall. He's got a hawkish nose, apparently a long beard since he was born, and has no issue with roughing it in the wild. He will eventually marry a Levice Chafin in 1861, and they will eventually have about 13 kids, building up the army, I suppose. Then the Civil War comes about. Devil Ant signs up along with a younger brother of his named Ellison. Let's pause here for just a second, because here's another piece of history that becomes contested. I've lived in the South practically my whole life, and the causes of the war are constantly disputed. In the past few years, there have been, debates about monuments to that conflict and whether or not the South's purpose was to perpetuate slavery. I still remember people referencing the war as the War of Northern Aggression. So, first off, if you want to know what the history was about, or anybody in history, read about what they said in their time. There were no attempts to dog whistle, to candy coat, to encode. If you read the secession documents, for example, the, individual declarations of independence from each state, over half of the 11 states to secede specify slavery as a cause, if not the cause, of their separation. For example, Mississippi, in its secession declaration from 1861, said in its second sentence, quote, "Our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. Its labor supplies the product which constitutes by far the largest and most important portions of commerce of the earth." End quote. Now, not every state felt the same way, or at least said so. North Carolina, where I live, for example, gives no reason for separating. But what we know is that they decide to secede after Lincoln calls for volunteers to help put down the rebellion that had started in South Carolina with the firing on Fort Sumter. North Carolina feels this is a strong-armed approach. And so the first colony to allow its delegates to move towards independence from Great Britain with the Halifax Resolves in April of 1776 now leaves the same union as a state to join the Confederacy. Happy 250th birthday. Also, it would have been sandwiched between Virginia, the capital of the Confederacy, and South Carolina, its cradle, so not a lot of choice for neutrality, I'd imagine. Still, if you read the cornerstone speech by the Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens given in Savannah, he specifically says, that the cornerstone of the Confederacy's Constitution is based on the, quote, great truth that the Negro is not equal to the white man, end quote. That's pretty plain. That's pretty straightforward. I don't think there's a lot of room to maneuver to suggest the Confederacy was for anything else. I mean, states' rights? Sure. But for what specific right? I think that's difficult for people in the South to come to terms with because, many people had ancestors that fought under that banner, obviously myself included, on both sides of my family. It's difficult to grasp that your region fought to maintain slavery, even if at that time they were open about their prejudices. Yet, I can drive on two major highways away from where I live and see two separate tall flagpoles flying Confederate flags, and neither are in locations I understand to have been battlefields. And even so, it's only the Confederate flag. Now, understand when I say Confederate flag, I mean the standard, battle flag of the Army of Northern Virginia, the X flag. The actual National Confederate flag, at least one of its iterations, looked different. 3 stripes, red, white, red, with a blue field and a circle of stars. I had a neighbor once that flew that one too. It makes me uncomfortable to see such a flag based on what they themselves said it stood for. Not what I want them to say or how I want it to be seen, but what they said. I mean, that flag for me is kind of ominous. Now, I don't think I can get too deep into this, but if we know what the symbolism of this flag was, we've heard the words of Alexander Stephens, and we've read the secession documents, and even understand the chess game of the various compromises and legislative acts between the non-slaveholding states and the slaveholding states leading up to the Civil War, such as the Missouri Compromise, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, even the cause for the caning of Charles Sumner, which, for your information, yes, a man was beaten with a cane in the old Senate chamber of the Capitol building. And on top of all that, we can't ignore this flag's unending use with white supremacists. So if we know all of these things, then why are you flying that flag? Undoubtedly, someone listening to this has one of these hanging in their garage or on their garage, and I'm curious as to why. The Dukes of Hazzard? or the actual Confederacy? I mean, I've heard people say it's because of heritage. Well, if we listen to Stevens, then the only heritage he's discussing is white heritage. Is the reason for flying it history? I mean, I can understand it being on a battlefield or a museum, but at your home alongside the road? I mean, we know what it stood for. Do you think they got it wrong when they are the ones who literally formed the Confederacies? Seriously, I'm open to hearing a discussion about this because this is a difficult one for me to understand. I don't want to think the answer is as simple as I think it is, but maybe that's my fault. Have the perceptions of that conflict also changed over time? Or have they not? Well, at any rate, perceptions of the conflict can get a bit more complicated because were the soldiers who were fighting for the Confederacy wanting to perpetuate that slavery? Let's take a look at our story. Western Virginia is very mountainous, and slavery was not widespread. In fact, it appears that the entirety of what would become West Virginia's population that was enslaved was less than 7%, as opposed to about 1/3 of the population of Virginia. Presumably because there was not enough farmland to profit from plantations. Now, as far as I'm aware, Devil Anse, who lived in this part of Virginia, didn't own slaves and never had. So why fight for the Confederacy? Was he in support of the peculiar institution that was slavery in the South? You know, I think the logical answer would be that you are on the border of Union states. And what can you do to defend your homes during a war? Perhaps you didn't choose to be on that side. Perhaps you did. The big question, and I need to ask someone smarter than me, is to discuss how you can fight under a banner whose general cause you don't believe in. Now, whether he did or not, we can't know. I strongly feel that Anse was staunchly independent, especially in the coming years, and I don't see how he would have been able to reconcile his independence with slavery, but, we'll never know, and I certainly don't. But it gets even more complicated, though, because for the most part, the western part of Virginia became tired of being pushed around by the eastern planter elite, these wealthy slave owners, and decided to secede from Virginia to create the new state of West Virginia in 1863 to be loyal to the Union. And this is about a year after Devil Anse joins the Confederacy with a group known as the VSL, or Virginia State Line. Now, does Anse decide to leave at this point when his home changes sides? No. But it gets stranger. The only person in this story, to my knowledge, that did own slaves was a man we haven't even been introduced to yet. His name was Asa Harmon McCoy. He owned 2 enslaved persons. In some accounts, those 2 enslaved individuals were married. And Asa served with the Union forces for Kentucky, as Kentucky was a Union state that allowed slavery. Now, for those of you not Civil War buffs, let me throw that out there that not all Union states opposed slavery. That kind of blew my mind. Okay? 2 people fighting for the Confederacy, in this case Anderson and his brother Ellison, didn't own slaves, and the one fighting for the Union did. Now, granted, until Antietam in 1862 and the passage of the Emancipation Proclamation shortly after, slavery wasn't entirely the focus of the war for the North. It was really just to keep the Union together. And here's something you may not know about the Emancipation. It didn't actually liberate any slaves because it only applied to states in open rebellion to the Union. The Confederacy wouldn't have cared if Lincoln issued it, so no slaves would have been freed there, but also Kentucky wasn't in open rebellion against the Union, so no slaves would have been freed there either. Now, I'm not trying to say that the Emancipation Proclamation wasn't important. It absolutely was. It changed the focus of the war from that one of keeping the Union together to one of abolishing slavery, and that helped out also internationally. It's just that, it didn't actually free any slaves. I do then have to say that this portion of my research did challenge preconceived notions of who fought for what and why. Sherman, in his memoirs, talked about how a lot of people in Louisiana didn't even want to secede, but that the state government sort of drug everybody along with them. So, I mean, there are a number of fascinating books, and I can start listing the ones I've read if you're interested. But let's get back to the issue. And this also brings up another question I get. Was the feud started because of the Civil War? Well, we just mentioned that a McCoy fought for the Union, and at least two Hatfields are fighting for the Confederacy. So, is that the start? Well, Asa has an older brother named Randolph, who we mentioned earlier will be the patriarch of the McCoys, and Randolph will also fight for the Confederacy. So let's put this aspect to bed that one family fought for one side while the other fought for the other. Most of the people in this area fought for the Confederacy, even crossing the state lines to do so. So the Civil War wasn't exactly why they began to fight, but we'll get into that later. Let's get back to my question, though. Why did Ance and eventually his younger brother Ellison join the Confederacy? We have no direct source material to enlighten us. It's quite possible that being so close to Union lines, the feeling was that an armed presence was necessary to repel potential Union activity. If you were seen as the enemy in a conflict where the Union is trying to prevent secession, they're going to invade you to stop you from seceding. So possibly to make sure you aren't burned out of your house, quote unquote. At any rate, they both serve, Anderson and Ellison, and neither leave when their home state secedes. Now, how they served also comes up quite a bit. As I had mentioned before, there's a belief that Ance got his nickname of Devil by his defense of the Devil's Backbone, also known as I think it's the Battle of Beech Creek on August 6th of 1862. But there's not a lot of evidence to suggest that particular standoff took place as far as the heroic antics of Devil Anse is concerned. Maybe evidence in the future will change that, but for now, I think that's myth. And even his younger brother Ellison, who we'll also meet again, is oftentimes to have had his service exaggerated. Okay. Now, I have a music album, yes, an entire vinyl album with 15 songs solely about the Hatfields and the McCoys from the 1970s that I bought in a record store in Raleigh some years ago. That album makes the claim of Ellison's service that said Ellison served at Gettysburg and with Lee at the surrender at Appomattox. Okay. I also have at least one book that makes somewhat the same claim. I mean, he's quite the hero, actually. Unfortunately, that's not true. Ellison actually went AWOL in December of 1864 after having served at Saltville with the 45th Battalion of the Virginia Infantry. Now, for anyone like me that feels like that was a bunch of words together that made no sense, let me break it down a little bit. Based on the dates and muster rolls, he therefore couldn't have been at Gettysburg because he was in Saltville and was AWOL by Appomattox, which was essentially the end of the Civil War. By the way, just as a side note, the last largest surrender by Confederate troops took place here in Durham, North Carolina. Almost 90,000 troops. So, in your face, Appomattox. Now, back to the topic. Based on what the myth is and what we have evidence for, people want or wanted to believe that Ellison was a Confederate hero for some reason. And why is that? I mean, why elevate a person standing in defense of a banner that, in their own words, stood for, less than palatable causes? Especially if their service wasn't as people want it to be. He wasn't at either of those famous events. I mean, does it make it sound more exciting? I mean, it's tough for me to wrap my head around. Perhaps in, trying to make common soldiers appear in heroic circumstances, it will, I don't know, somehow change the intent of the Confederacy, make it seem less slavey? Or is it trying to suggest that the men are more than the banner under which they fight? Still, they fought under that banner, so I'm not sure. This is probably why the Confederacy tries to reinvent itself immediately after their loss after the war. Well, anyway, as the units for Ellison and Devil Anse are going to be moved further away, both of them will leave their units and return home. So there's obviously not a desire on their part to see this fight happen to the end. So perhaps they aren't champions for this cause. Perhaps it's a necessary evil to protect their homes during the Civil War. At any rate, even if leaving the conflict, people in this river valley, which we should specify was the Tug River Valley, a border between now West Virginia and Kentucky, the people in this valley create a home guard. And this home guard is frequently referred to as the Logan Wildcats, but there are a ton of historians who claim that they weren't called that in their time, but were given the name after. At any rate, this home guard was a militia unit to defend their homes, and there is evidence of depredations happening across the border, not just war, but in some cases, even as simple as mischief. But the first death to officially occur in this conflict happens at the hands of this home guard. At this point is, by all intents and purposes, led by Jim Vance. Remember, he's the not-so-sweet uncle of Valentine or Wally, Anson Ellison, Uncle Jim Vance. He's leading this home guard contingent, and that death at the hands of this home guard is Asa Harmon McCoy. Now, as you remember, he was a Union soldier, owns 2 slaves. So a Union soldier is somehow killed by a home guard in a Union state, though the members are arguably Confederate sympathizers. So was this started because of the war? Not entirely, I can't say. Now, understand that by this time in 1865, there has been no centuries-long conflict. There has been no ancestral battle. This family of Hatfields and this family of McCoys lived in this valley and would even intermarry, which would bring about the question, was this a feud between 2 families at all? Well, at any rate, this first death of Asa Harmon McCoy turns out to be not so controversial. And how is that even remotely possible? Well, we'll get into that in our next episode of This Famous Vendetta. Thank you so much for listening. Give us a like, give us a review, subscribe, and find us on social media under This Famous Vendetta. Talk to us. We'd love to hear from you. Next episode should be in about 2 weeks. So go out there and make history in a good way. Thanks again. Take care.